My husband found out I was pregnant and said, "I need a DNA test." I replied, "Of course, darling." While he waited for the results, I had already met with a lawyer. What the test showed changed everything. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I had the kind of marriage people wrote about in greeting cards. Not the over-the-top, roses and champagne kind. Something quieter, more honest. Derek and I met at a mutual friend's barbecue in Charlotte, North Carolina 11 years ago. He was tall, broad-shouldered, laughing at something someone had said, and I remember thinking, that laugh is real. A real laugh is rare. I was 23 and just starting my first year at an architecture firm. He was 26 and managing projects at a mid-size construction company. We made sense together the way good blueprints make sense. Everything lined up. We married 4 years later. We bought a house in a quiet suburb with a yard big enough for a dog and someday kids. We got the dog first, a golden retriever named Cooper. The kids' part took longer than we planned, which was a private grief we carried carefully between us, the kind you don't talk about at dinner parties. 2 miscarriages in 3 years. Then finally, nothing. Years of trying in silence. So when I found out I was pregnant last October at 34, after a routine blood draw for something else entirely, I sat in my car in the clinic parking lot and cried for 20 minutes. Happy crying. The kind that surprises you with its violence. I drove home, set the test on the kitchen counter, and waited for Derek. He came home late that evening, which, I would later understand, was already a pattern I had been too trusting to question. He walked in distracted, loosening his tie, checking his phone. I pointed to the counter. He looked down, then up at me. I expected that laugh. The real one. What I got was something different. He smiled, yes. But it was a smile that moved across his face like it had somewhere else to be. He hugged me. He said the right words, but his eyes went back to his phone before his arms had finished letting go of me. I told myself, he's in shock. I told myself, men process differently. I told myself a lot of things in those early weeks because the alternative, that something was wrong, felt too large to look at directly. The first real warning sign came 3 weeks later. I came home early from a client meeting that had been canceled, and Derek's car was in the driveway in the middle of the afternoon. He worked across town. I walked in quietly, not sneaking, just tired, and I heard him in the kitchen, on the phone, speaking in a low, careful voice. The voice you use when you don't want to be overheard. "It's complicated right now," he said. Then a pause. I know, just give me time." He heard me come in and turned around too fast. "Work call," he said, before I had asked. I nodded. I put my bag down. I went upstairs. I stood in the bathroom and looked at my reflection in the mirror. 7 weeks pregnant, nauseous, with a face that was just beginning to learn what suspicion felt like. Over the following 2 weeks, the signs accumulated the way water accumulates in a basement, slowly, then all at once. He started working late 3 or 4 nights a week. He angled his phone away from me when texts came in. Once I noticed he had cleared his call history, something he had never done in 11 years of marriage. And then, one Sunday morning in early November, he sat down across from me at the breakfast table, folded his hands and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Measured, prepared. "Megan," he said. He only called me Megan when something was serious. "I've been thinking about the pregnancy." I set down my coffee. "Okay. I want to do a paternity test." The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. I looked at him. He didn't look away, which almost made it worse. "A DNA test," I said very quietly. "I just think, for peace of mind, for both of us." For both of us. As if I needed peace of mind. As if I had given him any reason, ever, in 11 years, to question me. As if I were the one who had been whispering into phones and clearing call logs. I felt something move through me in that moment. Not rage, not yet. Something colder and more clarifying. The feeling you get when an architectural calculation finally resolves itself and you understand exactly what the structure is made of. I looked at my husband across the breakfast table. In the house we had bought together, in the life we had built together, and I made a decision. "Okay, sweetheart," I said. I kept my voice steady. I even managed a small smile. "That's fine. Let's do the test." He blinked. He had expected tears, or anger, or questions. Not this. What Derek didn't know, what he couldn't have known, sitting there in our sunny kitchen on that quiet Sunday morning, was that while he waited for the results of a DNA test, I was already thinking about attorneys. The days after that Sunday were the loneliest I had ever spent inside my own marriage. On the surface, nothing changed. We still shared meals. We still slept in the same bed. We still said good morning and good night. But something fundamental had shifted. The way a wall looks the same from the outside even after the structure inside has failed. I was living in the shell of a house, and I was the only one who knew it. I didn't cry right away. I think I was too busy cataloging things. It's the architect in me. When I'm frightened, I measure. I list. I create order in the face of disorder. So I sat with myself quietly, and I began to count what I stood to lose. The house. We had paid $420,000 for it 6 years ago. My name was on the mortgage alongside his, my credit, my income, my careful, deliberate savings over a decade of professional work, the business contacts. Derek had, over the years, become friendly with several of my clients, not through me initially, but through the social proximity that marriage creates. If things turned ugly, that proximity could become a liability. My child. That thought hit hardest. I was 9 weeks pregnant, a real pregnancy, after years of loss. Whatever Derek believed or suspected or had done, this baby was mine. Protecting that child from the very beginning before they were even born became the fixed point around which everything else had to orbit. And then there was the question I had been circling but not yet asked myself directly. Why did he ask for the test? Not because he genuinely doubted me. I was certain of that. We had barely been physically present in the same room with other people over the past year. The pandemic hangover years, the working from home, the miscarriage grief that had made us both hermits for a while. I had not had the opportunity, let alone the desire, to betray him. He had asked for the test because he had done something. He had asked because guilt had made him paranoid. He had asked because somewhere in the architecture of his dishonesty, he had decided the best defense was a preemptive offense. The phone call, the cleared history, the late nights, the smile that had somewhere else to be. By the 3rd day, I was certain. My husband was having an affair and he was trying to destabilize me, pregnant, emotionally vulnerable, before I could figure it out. I needed to think clearly. That meant I needed to stop feeling first. I took a personal day from work on a Wednesday and drove across town to a coffee shop I had never been to, far enough from our neighborhood that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. I ordered tea. I sat by the window, and I thought for 3 hours. What did I actually know? behavioral changes, cleared call logs, one overheard conversation, suggestive but not conclusive. What would I need to protect myself legally? Documentation, a paper trail, an understanding of my rights. And what was the first step? An attorney. Not a confrontation, not an accusation. An attorney. I pulled out my phone and searched for family law attorneys in Charlotte with strong reviews and a reputation for handling high-conflict divorces. I found 3 that came up repeatedly in local forums and professional review sites. I emailed all 3 that afternoon, briefly and without detail, requesting a consultation. By the time I drove home, one had already responded. Her name was Laura Hayes. 12 years in family law, formerly with the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office. Her assistant's email was professional and warm, and they could see me Friday afternoon. I confirmed immediately. That night, I sat at dinner across from Derek, and I watched him. He was on his phone again. Work, he'd say, always work. And he had the faintly distracted look of a man trying to keep too many plates spinning. I felt something harden in me, watching him. Not hatred. Something more useful than that. He thinks I'm waiting, I thought. He thinks I'm confused and scared and waiting for him to tell me what to think. He didn't know me as well as he believed. I spent the next 2 evenings after Derek was asleep doing what I should have done weeks ago. I went through our joint financial accounts. Savings, checking, the brokerage account we had opened together 5 years ago. I took careful notes, balances, recent transactions, anything unusual. I photographed important documents I knew I would need. The mortgage deed, our tax returns from the past 3 years, his pay stubs, insurance policies. I kept everything on a personal cloud account Derek had no access to, under an email address I had created years ago for a freelance project and never linked to any shared device. I also started keeping a log, dates, times, his arrivals and departures, anything that struck me as notable. I wrote it in the Notes app of my phone, under a folder labeled with the name of a client project, buried 3 levels deep, boring, invisible. By Thursday night, I had a file. By Friday afternoon, I had a lawyer, and Derek still thought I was sitting quietly, waiting for a DNA test to come back. Some men underestimate quiet women. They mistake stillness for passivity and patience for surrender. Derek had lived with me for 7 years and somehow never learned the single most important thing about me. I had never once walked into a room without first understanding its structure. I knew the load-bearing walls of this marriage, and I was the only one who had thought about what happened when they came down. Laura Hayes' office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, with a view of the city that on any other day I would have appreciated architecturally. That Friday, I barely looked at it. She was a compact woman in her late 40s, dark-haired with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the manner of someone who had heard every version of every story and was not easily surprised. She shook my hand firmly, offered me water, and sat across from me with a legal pad. "Tell me everything," she said. "Don't edit." So I didn't. I told her about the years of trying for a pregnancy, the miscarriages, the distance that grief had put between Derek and me, the sudden pregnancy after all that silence, his reaction, the careful smile, the eyes that kept going to his phone, the overheard call, the cleared history, the late nights, and finally the Sunday morning request for a paternity test. Laura listened without interrupting. When I finished, she wrote something on her pad and looked up. "You haven't confronted him." "No." "Good. Don't. Not yet." She folded her hands. "Here's what I need you to understand. In North Carolina, this is an equitable distribution state. That means marital assets are divided fairly, not necessarily 50-50, but based on contribution and circumstance. If he is having an affair and can be proven to have dissipated marital assets, spending marital money on another woman, that can affect the distribution. It gives us leverage. Leverage. I wrote that word in my mind and underlined it. She walked me through my rights regarding the pregnancy, custody considerations, the timeline of a contested divorce. She was clear-eyed and practical, and she did not once look at me with pity, which I appreciated more than I could express. Before I left, she gave me a list. Things to gather, things to document, things to avoid. Don't move any money, she said at the door. Don't make large purchases. Don't do anything that could look retaliatory. You're not the one with something to hide. Act like it. I drove home feeling, for the first time in weeks, like I was standing on solid ground. It was in the following week that the evidence found me. Or rather, I found it. The way you find the source of a structural crack if you look carefully enough and follow it to its origin. I had a habit, when working from home, of using the shared household laptop for personal browsing when my work computer needed updates. Derek knew this. He had always been careful with his phone. But the laptop, perhaps he had simply forgotten. Perhaps he was careless. Perhaps, as Laura had suggested in our meeting, guilty people often are. I opened the browser on a Tuesday afternoon to look something up, and the autofill in the address bar offered me a suggestion. A restaurant I had never been to. I almost ignored it. Then I noticed the date in the browsing history. Last Thursday. Derek had told me he was working late last Thursday. I followed the thread carefully, the way you pull a loose wire to find where it connects. Over the next hour, I found enough. There was an open table reservation. 2 people, 8 p.m., a restaurant in the Noda neighborhood, the kind of place with low lighting and a wine list. There was a Google search for Romantic Hotels Charlotte, NC, from 6 weeks ago. And there was, buried in an auto-filled form, an email address I didn't recognize, tifruso7gmail.com, that had been used to fill in a field on what appeared to be a hotel booking confirmation. Tiff. The name that people name a certain kind of woman in a certain kind of story. I did not touch anything. I took photographs of the screen with my personal phone. I noted everything in my log. Then I closed the browser, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I sent Laura Hayes a message that evening. I have some documentation to share. Can we meet this week? She responded within the hour. Thursday at 2. Bring everything. Meanwhile, and this is the part I didn't anticipate, Derek had started to notice something. He couldn't name it, I think. It was too subtle. But in the 10 days since the breakfast table conversation, I had not cried, had not pressed him for reassurance, had not asked anxious questions about the DNA test or what it meant or where we stood. I had been polite, functional, and, this was the part that was making him uneasy, quiet in a way that was different from my usual quiet. He mentioned it to his mother. I know this because Barbara Collins, Derek's mother, a woman I had always been cautiously correct with, called me on a Wednesday evening under the pretext of checking on the pregnancy. "I just wanted to see how you were holding up, sweetheart," she said, in that particular tone she used when she was gathering information. "I'm well, Barb," I said. "Thank you for calling. Derek mentioned you've seemed a little distant lately. He's worried." "He's worried. Pregnancy can do that," I said pleasantly. "I've been tired." After I hung up, I added the call to my log. Date, time, content. The antagonists were beginning to circle. They just didn't know yet that I had already been watching them for weeks. My second meeting with Laura Hayes lasted nearly 2 hours. She reviewed every photograph I had taken, asked precise questions about dates and context, and by the end of the meeting, her expression had shifted from professionally neutral to something that might, on a less composed face, have been called satisfaction. "The hotel booking is strong," she said. "The restaurant reservation supports a pattern. The email address. Do you know who this Tiffany Ross is?" I had looked her up after finding the email. It hadn't taken long. Tiffany Ross, 31, worked in project development at a mid-size construction firm in Charlotte, the same industry as Derek. I found her LinkedIn. Professional headshot. The kind of smile that knew it was being photographed. "She works in his industry," I said. "Possibly someone he met through a conference or a shared project." Laura nodded slowly. "We'll build the documentation. I'll bring in a private investigator, someone I work with regularly, discreet and licensed. What I want from you right now is patience and silence." Patience and silence. I was getting good at those. Laura also explained the next formal steps: filing for divorce in Mecklenburg County, the process for equitable distribution, the approach we would take regarding the paternity issue given that I could prove without question that the child was Derek's. The DNA test he had requested would, she explained with something close to dry amusement, work entirely in my favor. "He asked for it," she said. "We'll let him have it." I authorized the investigator that week. His name was Paul Garrett, retired law enforcement, matter of fact, the kind of man who could stand in a parking lot for 3 hours and look like he was waiting for the bus. Within 10 days, he had what we needed: photographs of Derek and Tiffany Ross at the restaurant in Noda, at a hotel in South End, and, most damningly, at a property showing for what appeared to be an apartment in a building I recognized, a building with monthly rents that would require deliberate financial planning. He had been planning something more permanent. I forwarded everything to Laura. She said 2 words: "We're ready." We filed on a Thursday. The filing was quiet, procedural, invisible to anyone not looking for it. But Derek was served the following Monday morning at his office. He called me 4 times in the first hour. I let all 4 calls go to voicemail. The 5th time, I answered. "What is this?" His voice was controlled, but barely. "Megan, what is this?" "I think the paperwork is fairly self-explanatory," I said. "You're filing for divorce? Without talking to me? Without—" "You asked me for a DNA test," I said, "while I was pregnant with your child. I think we're a little past the talking stage, Derek." He came home that evening. I had expected that. What I hadn't expected was that he brought his mother. Barb Collins walked into my house, the house I had helped pay for, the house I had furnished and cared for, with the expression of a woman who had decided in advance who was in the wrong. She sat across from me in the living room, and she spoke carefully, in the measured tones of someone who believed herself to be negotiating. "Megan, we understand you're upset. Pregnancy hormones can—" "Don't," I said quietly. She blinked. "Don't what?" "Finish that sentence." Derek stepped in. He had switched tactics. The controlled anger was gone, replaced with something softer, more practiced. He talked about the stress of the past year, about fear, about how the pregnancy had triggered anxiety in him that he hadn't known how to handle. He did not mention Tiffany Ross. He did not acknowledge anything specific. "I want to work through this," he said. "We can go to counseling. The petition has been filed," I said. "You have an attorney's number in those documents. I'd suggest calling them." Barb stood up. The softness dropped from her face like a mask hitting the floor. "You are making a serious mistake," she said. "This family has resources that you don't want to be on the wrong side of. Derek has been nothing but—" "This conversation is over," I said. I stood. I walked to the front door and held it open. They left, but before Barb crossed the threshold, she turned and looked at me with an expression I recognized, the look of someone who believes they are not finished. She wasn't, but neither was I. After they left, I sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically, just because it was the closest surface, and I breathed slowly for a few minutes. My heart was loud. My hands were trembling just slightly, but I was still standing, or close enough. I called my OB the next morning and went in for a checkup. The baby was fine, strong heartbeat. I lay on the exam table and listened to that sound and let myself feel, for just a moment, completely and simply grateful. I took 3 days off from everything external. No calls to Laura, no reviewing documents, no research. I walked Cooper in the mornings. I slept. I ate the things the pregnancy books told me to eat. I watched 3 movies I had wanted to see for months. I let myself exist in the present tense. 3 days. That was all I permitted. Then I got back to work. The offer came on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after the papers were filed. Not from Derek directly, that was telling. It came through Barb via a handwritten note delivered by a neighbor who seemed uncomfortable being used as a courier and said as much. The note was brief. It suggested that if I were willing to withdraw the petition and return to the table in good faith, Derek would agree to drop the paternity test request and commit to couples counseling. There was a figure mentioned, a lump sum, framed as a good faith gesture, a number that was high enough to be taken seriously and low enough to be insulting. I read the note twice. Then I placed it in the file I kept for Laura. I thought about what the note was really saying. It was saying, "We didn't think you'd move this fast. We're recalibrating. We're afraid." The money was a temperature gauge, not a genuine offer. If I responded with interest, they would know I had a price. If I responded with anger, they would know they had rattled me. The correct response was the one that communicated nothing useful. So I said nothing at all. I didn't tell Derek I had received it. I didn't acknowledge the note through any channel. I forwarded it to Laura with a single line. "For the file." She responded, "Perfect." Derek, I learned from Laura's subsequent communications with his attorney, had hired a mid-level family law firm in Charlotte. Competent but not exceptional, which told me something about how seriously he had initially assessed the situation. He had underestimated me on the way in. That was a pattern I intended to maintain until it no longer served me. There was a period in those middle weeks of November when the external noise quieted and I was left alone with myself more than I had expected. Cooper and I fell into a routine. Morning walks when the light was pale and cool. Tea before my work calls. Evenings reading or drawing. I had gone back to sketching by hand, something I had abandoned years ago when everything moved to software. It steadied me. But there were nights that were hard, not because I doubted the decision. I was never uncertain about that. It was something else, grief for the version of the life I had expected to have. The baby shower with Derek's hand on my shoulder, the drive to the hospital with him in the passenger seat, making the same nervous jokes he made before every important event. The first night home from the hospital, the 3 of us, in the house I had believed was ours. Those images had to be grieved before they could be released. I let myself grieve them, one at a time, carefully and privately. It was my friend Cynthia who saw through the careful surface I was maintaining. We'd been close since graduate school. She was an interior designer working out of a firm in Raleigh, sharp and warm and constitutionally incapable of letting anything uncomfortable remain unaddressed. She drove down to Charlotte on a Saturday without announcement, knocked on my door, and handed me a bag of groceries. "You were answering my texts too quickly," she said. "You do that when something is wrong. You're managing me." I let her in. We sat in the kitchen for 3 hours. I told her everything, not the processed version I had been presenting to the world, but the actual thing. The breakfast table, the phone call, the hotel reservation, the night Derek and Barb had come to the house, the 3 days I had spent on the kitchen floor in manageable increments. Cynthia listened the way good listeners do, without rushing toward advice, without offering comfort before the whole thing had been said. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You're doing everything right," she said finally, "and that's making it lonelier, isn't it?" It was the most accurate thing anyone had said to me in months. She stayed the weekend. She made food and was opinionated about my curtains and made me laugh 3 times genuinely, which I had not done in longer than I could clearly remember. When she drove back to Raleigh Sunday evening, I stood at the door and felt something loosen slightly. Not resolve, not certainty, but the particular relief of being known by someone. Laura had also, gently and professionally, suggested I speak with a therapist, not as a flag of crisis, but as maintenance, the way an athlete works with a trainer, not because they're injured, but because the work ahead is demanding. I had agreed and found someone through a recommendation, Dr. Karen Mills, a licensed clinical psychologist with a practice near my office. My first session was unremarkable, which was what I needed. She asked careful questions. I answered honestly. She gave me 2 things I have kept: the observation that I was conflating strength with isolation, and the reminder that accepting support was not the same as losing control. By the end of that week, I felt different. Not lighter exactly, more consolidated, like a structure that has been properly reinforced. Derek and Barb were watching from a distance. I could feel it in the small signals, mutual acquaintances who called with carefully casual questions, a comment through a shared colleague about how Derek seemed really committed to working things out. Let them watch. I was not performing for an audience. I was simply preparing. They came on a Saturday morning in early December, unannounced. I saw Derek's car pull into the driveway from the upstairs window, where I had been reviewing documents with my second cup of tea. Barb was in the passenger seat. They sat in the car for a few minutes. I watched, invisible behind the curtain, and I could see from the movement of their heads that they were coordinating, deciding who would speak first, perhaps, setting the terms of the performance. I went downstairs and waited. The knock was unhurried, almost pleasant. I opened the door. Derek was holding a paper bag from a bakery I recognized, a place we used to go on Sunday mornings, early in our marriage. It was a calculated choice, that bag, a prop. "We just wanted to talk," he said. "No lawyers, no documents, just us. Can we come in?" I looked at him. I looked at Barb, who had arranged her face into something that was working hard to resemble warmth. I opened the door wider. I did not offer coffee. I sat in the armchair, deliberately leaving the couch for the 2 of them, and I waited. Derek set the bakery bag on the coffee table, unopened. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and spoke in the voice I recognized as his most rehearsed, genuine sounding, slightly pained, careful. "Megan, I know I hurt you. I know the test request was wrong. I panicked. I was scared. The pregnancy caught me off guard, and I handled it badly. I'm not proud of it." He paused. "But we have 11 years, and we have a baby coming. I don't want to throw that away over fear. Neither of us should." Over fear, not over what he had done. Over fear. Barb took her cue. "Megan, you're carrying my grandchild. I want to support you. We both do. This process, what you're going through legally, it's so hard on a pregnant woman. The stress, the uncertainty. Is this really what you want for your baby's beginning?" There it was, the hand reaching for the thing I loved most, using my child as a lever. I looked at her calmly. "The baby and I are doing very well, thank you." "But a divorce was not my preference," I said. "The circumstances made it necessary." Derek shifted. The rehearsed warmth was beginning to develop fissures. "If this is about Tiffany, you don't have to explain anything to me," I said. "That's what the attorneys are for." His jaw tightened. "You're being unreasonable. I'm sitting here trying to—" "You're not trying to reconcile, Derek," I said, and my voice stayed so level it surprised even me. "You're trying to stop a legal process that you've now realized is more serious than you expected. Those are different things." Barb stood up. The warmth dropped completely. Underneath it was something harder. The face she wore when she had decided patience was no longer worth the effort. "You listen to me," she said, and her voice was low and precise. "My son has resources and connections that will make this process very unpleasant for you. Judges in this county know our family. The attorney you've hired, she's competent, but she doesn't have relationships that we have. You are a woman alone, pregnant, working a salaried position. You can fight this, or you can walk away with something reasonable and your health intact. But don't mistake politeness for weakness." I let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. "I don't," I said, "and I hope you'll extend me the same courtesy." Barb picked up her bag. She gave me one last look, the kind designed to plant a seed of doubt, to follow you after the person has left the room. Derek stood too, and in his face was something I hadn't seen there before, a flicker of something that might have been genuine fear. They left without the bakery bag. I sat still for a long time after the door closed. My heart was beating faster than I wanted it to. I would be dishonest if I said what Barb had said hadn't landed. The mention of judges, of connections, the careful, articulated promise that this could be made harder than I was prepared for. I wasn't made of stone. The fear was real. But fear, I had learned in the past 2 months, is only a problem if it paralyzes you. If you can look at it clearly, name it, locate it in your chest, understand what it is telling you, it becomes something else. Information. And sometimes the right information makes you move faster. I picked up my phone and called Laura. "They came to the house," I said. A brief pause. "Tell me everything." I did. When I finished, I heard her exhale. "The comments about judges and connections, that's pressure behavior, possibly actionable if it continues. Are you okay?" "Yes," I said, and then more honestly, "I will be." "Good, because we have a deposition scheduled for the 14th, and I need you steady." "I'm steady," I said. After I hung up, I went upstairs and stood at the window. Outside, the December light was flat and pale. The street was quiet. Barb and Derek were gone. I placed both hands on my abdomen, gently, the way I had started doing without thinking about it, the small animal instinct of protection, and I made a promise I intended to keep. The deposition was held in Laura's conference room on a gray December morning, 14 days before Christmas. Derek arrived with his attorney, a man named Wallace Prynne, competent as Laura had assessed, conventional in his approach. Derek was dressed carefully, navy blazer, no tie, the studied informality of a man who had been advised to appear reasonable. He didn't look at me when he entered. That told me everything I needed to know about how he was feeling. The DNA test results had come back 6 days earlier. 99.97% probability of paternity. Derek was the father, which had never been in question. Not by me, not by any version of reality that existed outside his own guilt-driven paranoia. Laura had received the results, studied them briefly, and placed them in a folder with the expression of someone setting a card face down on a table. "We'll use these at the right moment," she had said. The right moment came during the deposition. Laura was measured and systematic in her questioning. She built slowly, establishing the timeline of the marriage, the shared assets, the mortgage, the financial contributions of both parties. Prin objected occasionally by habit more than necessity. Derek answered carefully, with the rehearsed caution of someone who had been coached. Then Laura placed the photographs on the table. The restaurant in Noda, the hotel in South End. Paul Garrett's photographs were professionally taken, clear, time-stamped, unambiguous. Derek and Tiffany Ross together in settings that admitted no innocent interpretation. Derek's attorney leaned in and spoke quietly to him. Derek's jaw moved. He looked at the photographs for longer than a coached person should. "Mr. Collins," Laura said with perfect evenness, "can you tell me who this woman is?" "A colleague," Derek said, careful, still holding. "And this location?" "A business dinner, at a hotel. The restaurant is inside the hotel." Laura nodded slowly. She reached into the folder again. She placed the hotel booking confirmation, name, dates, room type, payment method linked to a joint credit card we shared. A joint credit card. He had paid for it with money that was, legally, partly mine. The color changed in Derek's face. Prin put a hand on his arm. "Too late." There was a conference that week." "The conference was in Raleigh," Laura said pleasantly. "We checked. You were not registered. The hotel is in Charlotte." She paused. "Mr. Collins, how long have you been in a relationship with Tiffany Ross?" "I don't think—" Prin started. "Approximately?" Laura continued. Derek looked at me for the first time. It was a strange look. Not a plea exactly. More like a man discovering that the ground he thought was solid had been hollow all along. "Several months," he said. The room was quiet. Laura reached into the folder for the last time. "I'd like to introduce the results of the paternity test you requested," she said. "The test that was your idea, Mr. Collins, which was submitted through a licensed testing service and resulted in a finding of 99.97% paternity probability." She placed the document in front of his attorney. "Your client accused his pregnant wife of infidelity, initiated a DNA test, and the result confirms that the child is his. While documentation establishes that it is your client who is maintaining an outside relationship, funded in part with marital assets." Prin was reading the results. Derek was very still. "Furthermore," Laura continued, "we have documentation of a communication to my client that referenced judicial connections in Mecklenburg County as a means of influencing the outcome of these proceedings. We have preserved that communication and are prepared to file a formal complaint if necessary." That was the moment Barb's words in my living room, delivered with such precision, such confidence, came back around. Derek turned to his attorney. Something was happening in his face that he could not control, the careful surface fracturing under the accumulated weight of what was on that table. Prin spoke quietly to him. Derek shook his head once, then stopped. "We need a recess," Prin said. "Of course," Laura said. During the recess, I stood at the window of Laura's office and looked out at the city. 12 floors up, Charlotte spread out below. The financial district, the midtown buildings, the neighborhoods I had driven through for 11 years. I thought about the woman who had sat in the parking lot of a medical clinic in October, crying into a steering wheel because she was finally pregnant. She had not known what was coming, but she had not collapsed when it arrived. The deposition resumed 20 minutes later. Derek's posture had changed. Prin did most of the talking. The word settlement appeared for the first time. I looked at Laura. She looked at me. A small, professionally restrained nod. We had him. The settlement negotiations lasted 3 weeks. Laura was exact and implacable. She knew what I was entitled to under North Carolina law, and she did not ask for less. Derek's attorney pushed back at certain points. The brokerage account, the mortgage equity, a retirement fund Derek had opened before we married, but contributed to jointly during the marriage. Laura held the line on each of them with the patience of someone who knows they are holding the stronger position. The affair, the misappropriation of marital funds, the paternity test request, all of it had shifted the moral and legal landscape of the proceedings. Derek had arrived at this process believing he was on solid ground. He learned, slowly and expensively, that the ground had been eroding for months. Prin attempted in the second week of negotiations to reframe the affair as emotionally motivated by the distance that had grown between Derek and me during the years of pregnancy losses. It was a strategy I had anticipated. The sympathetic backstory, the humanizing context, the suggestion that fault was somehow distributed. Laura dismantled it methodically, without dramatics. The court was not interested in emotional context when financial documentation was this clear. Marital funds had been spent. The record showed it. Context did not change the figures. On the 23rd of December, 4 days before Christmas, we reached a final agreement. I was awarded the house, the full equity, 6 years of mortgage payments, the appreciation of a property in a neighborhood that had grown considerably since we purchased it. I kept my retirement accounts in full. I received a settlement payment from the brokerage account that reflected both my contribution and the documented misappropriation of marital funds for the affair. I received child support calculated on Derek's full income, including a recent bonus his attorney had attempted to obscure in the financial disclosures, and which Paul Garrett had with quiet competence located through public business filings. Derek had moved out 2 weeks earlier, into an apartment in a building I recognized, the same one Paul had photographed him visiting with Tiffany Ross at a property showing. That information had been in the file Laura presented. It had not helped his case. The custody arrangement was this: primary physical custody with me. Derek received scheduled visitation, supervised initially per the court standard protocol for cases involving contested paternity claims and documented dishonesty. His attorney had objected to the supervised provision. The judge, who had, it turned out, no particular connection to the Collins family, and who read every document Laura presented with careful attention, had upheld it. That detail, more than any other, I think, was what finally reached Barb Collins in a way that the financial losses had not. She had built her threat around the idea of judicial access, of relationships, of a family name that meant something in this county. The judge had read the file and ruled on its contents. The name had not appeared in his considerations. I know this because Prin, in a moment of unguarded frustration near the end of the final negotiation session, said something to Laura about the Collins family having expected more deference from the bench. Laura had written it down. She didn't need to use it, but she wrote it down. When the final papers were signed and the last file was closed, Laura walked me to the elevator and shook my hand. "You are a good client," she said. "Clear-headed, patient. You didn't give them anything to work with." "I had a good attorney," I said. She smiled, professional, warm, brief. That too. I drove home through Charlotte on a gray December afternoon, past streets I'd been driving for 11 years, past the coffee shop where Cynthia and I used to meet on Fridays, past the bakery whose paper bag Derek had set on my coffee table, unused, on the morning he and Barb came to negotiate with me, past the clinic where, in an ordinary October, everything had changed. I pulled into the driveway of the house that was now entirely mine. Cooper was at the window, as he always was. I could see his tail moving. I sat in the car for a moment. There was no triumphalism in what I felt. I want to be honest about that. When you win something that you should never have been required to fight for, the victory is complicated. There is relief, deep, bone-level relief, the kind that makes your eyes burn. There is grief for the version of things that should have existed. And there is something else, harder to name, a kind of sobriety, the understanding that you are different now, that you know things about yourself and about others that you did not know before, and that knowledge is not free, but underneath all of it, steady and quiet, the heartbeat I had first heard on an exam table in November, still strong, still real. I went inside. Cooper pressed against my legs. I put my hand on my abdomen, the clear swell of it now, unmistakable, and I stood in the kitchen of my house and breathed. I had walked into this process with almost nothing but clarity and the willingness to be patient. I was walking out with my home, my financial security, my child, and myself. Derek Collins and Barbara Collins had arrived at this conflict with resources and confidence, and the assumption that a pregnant woman without a plan was a woman without power. They had been wrong, and the results had, in the end, shown exactly what Derek had asked for, the truth. My daughter was born on the 14th of April, 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a cry that filled the delivery room like a small, magnificent announcement. I named her Eleanor. Ellie for the first few months, while she was still learning to exist in the world, and I was learning to exist in this new version of mine. Cynthia was in the waiting room. She cried more than I did, which is accurate to their respective characters. Dr. Mills sent flowers. Laura Hayes sent a note in her clean, precise handwriting that said simply, "Congratulations. She's going to be extraordinary. I believe that." The months after Eleanor's birth settled into a rhythm I had not dared to imagine during the worst of the preceding winter. I had taken a modified schedule at the firm for the first 3 months. They had been more than accommodating. I had been there 8 years and brought in 3 significant clients, and the mornings became mine. Breakfast at the kitchen table while Ellie discovered her hands. Walks with Cooper through the neighborhood where the spring light came in long and pale through the new leaves. I went back to full-time work in July and found that I was better at it than I had been before. That surprised me, then didn't. The focus I had developed during those hard months, the discipline of attention, the ability to assess a situation without letting fear drive the analysis, translated directly into my work. I was designing a mixed-use development near the Arts District that summer, a project I had wanted for 2 years. I got it. My colleagues noticed something different about me, too. A steadiness in meetings, a patience with difficult clients, a willingness to hold a position under pressure without raising my voice. One senior partner told me, with genuine puzzlement, that I seemed more settled than he'd ever seen me. I smiled and said I'd had a productive year. My finances were stable in a way they had never been when Derek and I were managing things jointly. The house was mine. The equity was mine. The child support came reliably, process through the court system with the mechanical neutrality of a legal order. I did not have to negotiate or chase or remind. The law simply worked. I saw a therapist every other week. I had started running in the mornings, slowly and comically at first, then less so. Cynthia drove down once a month and we ate well and talked too late and let Ellie sleep between us in the mornings while Cooper laid across the foot of the bed. It was a small life, and it was entirely, deliberately, profoundly mine. Derek, I learned through the thin membrane of mutual acquaintances, had moved in with Tiffany Ross at the apartment in South End within 3 months of the divorce finalizing. It lasted 8 months. I heard this from a former colleague of Derek's who mentioned it without apparent agenda, simply as information. Tiffany had ended the relationship. I didn't know the particulars and didn't pursue them. What I did hear, later and from a different source, was that the breakup had not been quiet, that there had been arguments about money, about the child support obligations that had trimmed Derek's disposable income considerably, about a future Tiffany had imagined that looked quite different from the one she found herself in. The apartment in South End, it turned out, was harder to afford on a single salary when a court order had its claim on a meaningful portion of the other. I found, to my own mild surprise, that I had no particular feeling about it either way. The emotion that had once attached to Derek, love, trust, grief, anger, fear, had resolved into something more neutral. He was the father of my daughter. That was what he was. He came to his supervised visitations consistently, to his credit. He was good with Ellie in the distracted, slightly uncertain way of a man still learning to be a parent. I was professional with him. He was professional with me. We had both understood after the deposition that performance was no longer available to either of us. Barb Collins called once, in the summer. She wanted to discuss the visitation schedule. Her tone was controlled and stripped of warmth. The working voice, not the performance. I listened. I responded factually. I thanked her for calling. When I hung up, I felt nothing at all, which was its own kind of peace. The woman who had sat across from me in my living room in December and spoken of judges and connections and my smallness against her family's resources, that woman had found that resources do not substitute for evidence, and connections are not the same as being right. What she had called weakness, I had been allowing her to misread. I was sitting on the back porch on a warm September evening, Ellie asleep in the monitor beside me and Cooper a comfortable weight against my feet, when I understood clearly, perhaps for the first time, that I was happy. Not in the greeting card way, not the performed happiness of someone trying to prove a point, the real kind, the kind that is quiet and interior and doesn't require an audience. I looked out at the yard, the one we had bought for a dog and someday kids, and I thought about the woman I had been in October of the previous year, sitting in a clinic parking lot crying with relief, believing the hardest part was behind her. She hadn't known yet what was coming, but she had, I think, known herself well enough to survive it. That turned out to be enough, more than enough.